Day 43. Digby to Bridgewater. I woke up groggy from last night's attempt at falling asleep. I car camped at the Walmart in Digby after a long day exploring the northern shore of Nova Scotia, my home province. Little did I know that the Walmart parking lot in the evening becomes a breeding ground for young teens who like to do burnouts, smoke marijuana, and party. While they were not causing havoc like the teens in other parts of Canada, it was difficult for me to sleep in such noise and racket. After my morning routine, I hastily left to explore the Water Street and Digby Pier. Similar to yesterday, the weather wasn't all that great. I didn't spend too much time here, but I did check out a small lighthouse. Shortly after, I drove up to the Point Prim Lighthouse not too far away. By then, the overcast sky lifted, and I was able to enjoy the beautiful surroundings. This lighthouse was automated and wasn't a museum like several of the other lighthouses I visited previously. The rocky surroundings made for a lovely place to have a snack while viewing the Bay of Fundy. I walked around the rocky cliff, remembering how beautiful my home province was. While I was curious to peer over the edge, I knew that no one in my family had any idea that I embarked on a cross-country road trip during this pandemic. Therefore, it would be horrible if I fell to my death or was seriously injured. Sections of this rocky outcrop gently dipped into the ocean. But again, if I were to slip and fall, it could have been possibly a tragic outcome. After enjoying some time here, I headed over to a place I researched previously. I was going to head over to the ferry that led to Balancing Rock. I drove over to the East Ferry village, where I waited in line to get onto a car-carrying ferry that led over to Tiverton. After a brief crossing, I drove up to another lighthouse, the Boar's Head Lighthouse. Why it had such an unusual name was not known to me. Again, the fog was settling in, and it was quite windy when I reached the lighthouse. Along the way, I found a hippie couple in an old Volkswagen van stealth camping. Their vehicle had Quebec plates, so I was happy to see that I wasn't the only one enjoying what little semblance of freedom we had. This lighthouse was also uninhabited and automated. It had some signs of age, otherwise it was in very nice restored condition. Like many of the buildings I have seen since Gaspe, the ocean took its toll on the buildings close to the shore. I didn't spend too much time here as well, as my mind was saturated with all of the lighthouses I have seen. I drove down to Balancing Rock, where I was able to visit the famous basalt formation close by. Previous to my road trip, I was exercising 2 hours a day, 5 days a week, and was in excellent physical condition. I haven't exercised since I was in Ottawa, so I actually found this otherwise easy trek to be moderately tiring. There was a parking lot that was in rather unkempt condition from previous visitors that had a path leading up to Balancing Rock. This area of Nova Scotia was quite peculiar, as it had car ferries that led from the mainland over to these two small islands. Sparsely populated communities resided on these islands, and while I was only planning on visiting Long Island, where Balancing Rock was located, I knew that I would return one day to visit Brier Island as well. Taking the well-maintained path down to Balancing Rock was, again, moderately challenging for me, given my lack of exercise, but it was great to be back in nature. The soft ground and the roots along the path reminded me of how I used to hike quite often back on the west coast. After a brief trek, the path started to descend as I was closer to the water. I followed the wooden steps down to the cliffs of the basalt formation. The fog came in again, along with the wind, but I was greeted by a structural platform and walkway leading to Balancing Rock. This reminded me of Bout du La Monde back in Gaspe. These basalt formations were formed millions of years ago, and I could only imagine how much these boulders would weigh. Plaques were set in to describe the events creating the geography of this area and how Balancing Rock came to be. Balancing Rock itself was set apart from the structural platform, and the walkway ended about 10 meters from Balancing Rock. I could see how some people could have easily climbed over and walked up the Balancing Rock itself, and while I was tempted to do so, I decided against it. Again, I have family to answer to that knew nothing about my whereabouts. On the way back to Digby, I passed by Sandy Cove at low tide. Ships were sitting on the ocean floor. It was cool to see this common theme in Atlantic Canada, while back on the west coast this never would be the case. This was such a scenic drive back to Digby. After being back on the mainland of Nova Scotia, I continued west on the Evangeline Trail. Driving for a while, I stopped at a magnificent-looking church, the Église Catholique Saint Bernard. This church by the water reminded me of Saint-Anne-des-Monts in Quebec, where I stayed for a few days. Not quite abandoned, but far from busy given the restrictions in place. I walked the grounds briefly, wandering into the cemetery overlooking the beautiful ocean beyond. In these grounds, I felt a sense of calm. The world had become absolute chaos with the pandemic, and while society had been in crisis since COVID and the governments around the world set in restrictions, here I was enjoying whatever remaining freedom I had. It was a blessing to be here. The Église Catholique Saint Bernard was built by devout Catholic Acadians by primitive means as their testament to their beliefs in God Almighty. I could imagine the history of this beautiful church and all of the people who have passed through its doors over its many years since completion. I continued onwards, but not too far down the road, I found another beautiful church, the Église Catholique Sainte-Marie. For some reason, it reminded me of the beautiful church I had seen on my first day on Prince Edward Island as I was driving to a car camping spot for the evening. This church had a school on its grounds, so I knew it was still functional. While not quite as ornate as the Église Catholique Saint Bernard I just visited earlier, it was still beautiful to see how the people of Atlantic Canada were very faithful and believed in something greater than themselves. I wasn't quite sure if the church would have been open due to the restrictions, but it would have been interesting to visit. Some of the churches in Atlantic Canada were older than Canada itself. I continued down the Evangeline Trail until I decided to take a short detour, as I wanted to be by the ocean again. I took a side road down to Bear Cove, a small rocky cove that was uninhabited at the time. I could imagine that normally this would be a place for locals to relax by the water during the evenings and weekends with a bonfire. It was low tide, which allowed me to walk further out without getting my feet wet. I didn't stay here long, but again, it was great to be by the ocean in my home province. The wind in my face, the water by my feet, and the feeling of reconnecting to my home province gave me a sense of calm throughout the madness that this world was going through. I headed back to my beast and continued onward on the Evangeline Trail. Checking Google Maps, I found another cool lighthouse close by, so I took the detour to head on over. I arrived at the Cape St. Mary Lighthouse. While I have seen some beautiful lighthouses, this one was particularly beautiful for its surroundings. Like many of the other lighthouses I have seen, this one was uninhabited and fully automated. It was also in relatively good condition and restored quite well. Unlike others, there was no museum or possibility to enter the lighthouse itself. While the lighthouse didn't stand out compared to others I had visited, just the location and its surroundings were truly spectacular. The weather was still overcast, so it was difficult to see, but the cliffs around the lighthouse were beautiful. There is a barrier to prevent visitors from venturing too far, as a fall from these cliffs would ultimately lead to death. The grounds themselves served as a beautiful backdrop to enjoy an afternoon picnic or a late dinner to watch the sunset. As with many lighthouses, there is a long-standing history to the Cape St. Mary Lighthouse, as indicated by the numerous plaques placed throughout the grounds. I headed back to my beast as I knew that it would be time to grab a bite somewhere. As I was leaving, I seen the two women from Ontario pull up to the lighthouse. These were the two women I seen yesterday at the Walton Harbour Lighthouse around the same time. I looked at them as I was certain they recognized my beast and they recognized me. My bashfulness prevented me from waving to them, but it was great to see others enjoying my beautiful home province. As I was leaving, I made a brief stop at Mavelet Beach just down the road. It was surprising to see that despite the less than ideal weather, as well as the nationwide restrictions, people were still enjoying the beach. Not many, but there were some paddlers enjoying the cold Atlantic Ocean. I headed back to my beast, searched on Google for the next cool destination. I found Cape Fortune, another cool lighthouse which had the possibility of making the circular trek all the way to the top. I decided to head over. Continuing to drive down the Evangeline Trail, I took the slight detour that would lead to Cape Fortune. Along the way, I stopped at a rest area which had a memorial for those who were lost at sea, as well as the history of this area known as Yarmouth. Yarmouth is a well-known town in Nova Scotia's west coast with a long-standing history. Many towns along the shores of Nova Scotia have memorials for the countless lives who had been lost at the sea over the centuries. Again, the weather was not pleasant with the skies being overcast, but at least it wasn't too windy here, despite being right along the west coast with the Atlantic Ocean at my feet. I walked along the rocky beach thinking about how busy this area would have been were it not for the restrictions. Here I was, in the middle of a global pandemic, enjoying a cross-country road trip and being in my home province. I have traveled across Canada to get here from Victoria. I felt a tremendous sense of gratitude. Just down the road, I arrived at Cape Fortune. It was difficult to find parking at first, but eventually I was able to find a spot for my beast. Surprisingly, it was quite busy with tourists here. The Cape Fortune Lighthouse itself was quite unique compared to the many lighthouses I've seen throughout my travels. Now, all lighthouses across Quebec and Atlantic Canada were unique in their own way. Some of them were ordinary, while others were spectacular. The Cape Fortune Lighthouse was very unique for being a circular lighthouse, resembling more of a tower than an actual lighthouse. There were steps leading up to the lighthouse, as well as a museum. While I was curious, I didn't enter the museum as I was more interested in climbing the many steps that led up to the lighthouse. Unfortunately, I discovered that since the pandemic, very few people were able to embark on the trek to the top of the lighthouse, and reservations had to be made far in advance. I walked around the beautiful rocky shoreline around the Cape Fortune Lighthouse, looking at the geography that took millions upon millions of years to come to be. I would never tire of being in my home province and right by the water. The sound of the waves splashing against the rocks and the breeze of the salty air blowing on my face. The grounds around the Cape Fortune Lighthouse were very well maintained with a proper walking path and numerous areas to explore. I came across an interesting sight. A real skeleton of a fin whale. This was quite large, and I had to visualize how large this animal would have actually been when it was alive. It is well preserved despite being exposed to the harsh elements of being by the coast. While it was forbidden to touch or even come close to the skeleton, it was quite an interesting sight to see. I couldn't fathom how heavy of a beast this fin whale was. Just looking at the diameter of the vertebrae or even the jawbones, everything was massive in size. This interesting site was one of the most visited sites in and around Yarmouth. Named Foggy, this fin whale was discovered by a fisherman and then donated to the Cape Fortune Museum. Apparently, this fisherman had discovered the whale carcass around Wood Islands and transported it piece by piece to his home, then painstakingly set it out on his property for display. Eventually, he donated the skeleton, and this would be where it would reside permanently for everyone to enjoy. I headed back to my beast as I continued along the Evangeline Trail until I covered the western coast of Nova Scotia. This scenic drive started to head eastwards along the southern shore of Nova Scotia, and I knew from that point on I was heading towards my hometown of Halifax. My heart filled with excitement, as I knew I was drawing near to my hometown. I wouldn't arrive in Halifax that evening, as there were a number of wonderful places I wanted to stop along the way. Along the way, I researched another lighthouse, the Western Head Lighthouse. This particular lighthouse wasn't anything special compared to the beautiful lighthouses I'd seen earlier. This looked more like just a facility that operated as a lighthouse more than anything else. I took a few pictures, walked around a little bit by the rocky shore, and left shortly after. I continued driving until I arrived at Liverpool, another well-known town in Nova Scotia. I walked around the Fort Point Lighthouse Park. This was a well-maintained park which had the small Fort Point Lighthouse and some cannons along the shore. Due to the pandemic, nothing was open, but it was nice to walk around the beautiful park overlooking the ocean. Nestled in a residential neighborhood, it was quite easy to overlook this scenic spot when passing through Liverpool, but I thought it would be a nice place to visit in the future when the world returned to normal. I returned to my beast, drove through this lovely town of Liverpool before heading to Bridgewater, where I would find a Walmart to car camp for the evening. Before arriving in Bridgewater, I briefly stopped by another lighthouse park. Port Medway wasn't exactly on the route that I planned to take, but it was nice to stop by the ocean once more before retiring for the evening. By now, the sun was beginning to set, and I knew I would have to grab some dinner and find my way to Bridgewater, so I didn't spend too much time here. I just walked around, took a picture, and left. I drove up to Bridgewater, grabbed some horrible food, and settled for the evening in the Walmart parking lot. With so many fresh memories, I closed my eyes thinking about what lay in store for tomorrow. Thank you for sharing in my experience. If you enjoyed my video, please consider subscribing to my channel. I would truly appreciate you sharing my video on your social network, as it helps my channel grow. Be sure to check my playlist to see different categories on my exciting adventures I'm sharing with the world. Life is an adventure. Let's share this experience together.